I'm here with Judy Mundey, the wife of the late, great Jack Mundey, at Eastlakes Reserve, shortly to be renamed the Jack Mundey Reserve, because this reserve, this park, this magnificent park, wouldn't be here without Jack Mundey and the Builders Labourers Federation's activities here on behalf of the residents nearly 50 years ago. Judy, it's an honour and a privilege that you've been able to join me.
Thanks, Ron. I'm very pleased to be here. It was the second ever green ban that the BLF imposed, and as a result the park is here. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm so pleased that the land is still here, and I'm delighted that it's going to be called after Jack.
I grew up in this area and we were promised a shopping centre and houses started being built here, and then all of a sudden Parks Development decided on this old Rosebery racecourse that they were going to build these apartment buildings everywhere, and the residents were beside themselves. I remember as a teenager the bricks being delivered on this site, and these buildings were just going to be built everywhere, and I know locals smashed up the bricks, but they really didn't know what to do. The council supported the developers, and we were in a terrible position at that particular point in time. And it was Jack and the BLF who came to the residents' aid.
Well, what made it even worse, Ron, was that the residents had been promised that this would remain open land, that this would be a reserve. And then next thing, building materials appeared on the site. The residents were up in arms about it. By that time, the first green ban had taken place at Kelly's Bush at Hunters Hill, and the residents heard about that, and they went to the Builders Labourers Federation and said, what about helping us? There was a good strong residents action group in the area here. They went to the union. The union said to them, well, if you hold a public meeting and show us that it's not just a few people, but that's what the people in the area want, that's what the residents want, to retain this as open parkland as they were promised, then we'll see what we can do. So a big public meeting was held, and the residents then said to the union, well, you've seen that there's a lot of public support. The union agreed to impose a green ban, and it was the second ever green ban.
You know, I remember at the time, all the local residents here, we all felt absolutely powerless, because where else could people go until the BLF and Jack Mundey began this green ban movement?
Yes, well, of course, the union didn't start off in being involved in environmental and heritage issues. It was a very corrupt union when the rank and file won the leadership finally after a big campaign, and they set about improving the wages and conditions of the workers in the industry. They civilised the building industry, if you like. But there were also speeches about what should happen with people's labour and whether they ought to have some say as to the outcome of their labour. And the people at Hunters Hill had tried to prevent the development that was going to take place at Kelly's Bush. They went to the union. The union then became involved in an environmental issue. And after that, it steamrolled. And so, as you know, not only Eastlakes Reserve, but Centennial Park, large swathes of the rocks, and many other areas had green bans imposed. And so large parts of Sydney were saved from either having freeways put through the middle of them, or and where open space was retained, and in many cases where heritage buildings that were either architecturally or historically important were saved by the union bans.
You know, it's amazing. People look at unions and they believe that unions are there to look after workers and working and workers' conditions, but to have a union with the foresight to look after things like heritage and environment and open space, that was really something not known in Australia.
No, there had been some political actions by unions, for example, during the Second World War. But you're right, the things that the Builders Labourers did had not been done by other unions. And Jack used to say, well, what's the good of winning higher wages and better conditions if you're going to live in a treeless and polluted world? And so we need to do something about those issues as well. And they did. And they were highly successful.
So Jack came from the Atherton Tablelands and he was a rugby league player and was scouted by by Parramatta Football Club, although we're all Rabbitohs here, but was scouted by Parramatta Football Club, and that's what caused him to come to Sydney, and he got a job on site as a builder's labourer. That's how he got involved with the union, wasn't it?
He did. He came down to play rugby league, and he then, in those days, people weren't paid money. I mean, nowadays people get a fortune playing rugby league and other sports, but in those days that didn't happen. He did become captain coach of a couple of teams actually, and he was successful at that, and you were paid a small amount of money, but he of course had to work during the week, so it wasn't that he was that interested in the building industry. It just provided an income between rugby league matches. And so he got a job as a builder's labourer, but found that it was very uncivilised. The wages were low, the conditions were abysmal, and so he joined the rank and file organisation and became involved in trying to do something about cleaning up a quite corrupt union. And the rank and file eventually won through, and they ran campaigns to improve the wages, improve the conditions, bring about workers' compensation for workers who didn't have it at that time. And so they were a very successful union, doing all of the things that traditionally were done by unions. And it was that formed the basis for the support that the union had when it began to be involved in environmental or heritage issues. The members strongly supported the leadership, and that wouldn't have happened had they not improved things so much for the workers on the job and given them a lot more dignity and pride in themselves than they'd ever had before. And so they supported what the leadership did. Of course, not only did the union require that with all of the green bans that there be a public meeting to decide whether large numbers of people wanted it to happen, but they also went to the union members. They held meetings of the union members, put to them what the issues were, and the members then supported whatever it was that was proposed, and that's how they proceeded. They always did it on the basis of community support and the support of the membership of the union.
Well, the green ban was imposed, I think it was November 1971, and it took till 1974, and that green ban to be maintained for all those years, for ultimately the developer and the council and the state government to put their hands up and give up and sign a deed to return this land to the people as parkland. So not only did it require a green ban, it required strength for a number of years, and that probably impacted upon jobs that people could have had.
Well, that's true, although there was a lot more work in the building industry. There was a lot of work in the building industry at that time. But nonetheless, workers were prepared to give up an income that they could have had by doing that work for something that was much more important and much more long-lasting. And so they agreed to do what was proposed in a whole number of instances. I mean, who now would suggest that this would look better being covered by yet more buildings and without the green lung that it provides here? Who would suggest that Centennial Park should have a sports stadium on it, and so on with all of the other bans? So yes, workers were prepared to give up an income in many of those instances, but they were prepared to do it, and good on them. Areas like this still exist because of it.
And of course, those green bans occurred in a number of sites, a number of heritage sites throughout Sydney. But it wasn't just an easy thing to do, even from an industrial point of view. It was a rather dangerous thing to do. A couple of people were kidnapped. The famous Juanita Nielsen in 1975 disappeared and murdered. So it was a very dangerous time, wasn't it?
Well, it was. That was absolutely shocking. And another person was kidnapped and was too afraid to be involved in the struggle after that. That was in relation to the Victoria Street issue. And of course, as you can imagine, our family was threatened many times, and that was very disturbing during that time. But Jack's view was that that if these issues were important, you had to fight for them.
And Jack spent the remainder of his life fighting for these issues beyond his service to the Builders Labourers Federation and its successors, didn't he?
I can't tell you the number of campaigns that Jack was involved in, a whole number of them successful, some not, but he continued until not long before he died. I mean, we went to the marvellous school students against climate change march that was held in September of 2019, and he could almost not, I mean, he was very unwell by that time, but insisted that it was so important that we ought to be there to support those students who'd taken this marvellous action. So yes, he continued. And well, there was another green ban placed on the pavilion at Bondi. That was a successful green ban. And Jack actually spoke at that. That was just a couple of years before he died. So no, he continued. There were many places, many campaigns where people asked Jack to be involved, and I never saw him refuse to be involved in any of them.
Do you know, one of the things that amazes me to this day, the developers and governments will say development means jobs. Nobody looks at something that's environmentally sustainable, nor do they look at what the quality of life will be at the end of the day. It seems like history's repeating itself, isn't it? The community really need to start fighting the same wars that it fought 50 years ago under Jack's leadership.
Oh, look, they never stop. I mean, you probably, like me, saw something about what's happening with the Amazon workers in the United States. It's just staggering that somebody with the wealth of the owner of that business, Bezos, who's a multi-billionaire, is so resistant to a union being formed by the workers in that industry. But, of course, without unions, wages, conditions would deteriorate sharply. So there'll always be a need for unions as far as I can see. Nothing's handed out to people. People have to fight for those rights. Certainly that's what happened in the building industry, and they were very successful in their time at improving things, improving wages, conditions, the lives of workers in that industry. So they're a very successful union.
Well, we're here at what shortly will be the Jack Mundey Reserve. This magnificent park here in Eastlakes is only here because of the leadership of Jack Mundey, supported by the Builders Labourers Federation. As Judy observed, you can't possibly imagine this dense part of Eastlakes without this magnificent reserve in the middle. What sort of quality of life would people have? So the people of Eastlakes, and in fact the people in this region, will be forever grateful to Jack Mundey's contribution to this community. And Judy, we are so grateful, and we're so grateful that Bayside Council accepted my recommendation to name this park after Jack as a fitting memorial to a person who made such an outstanding contribution, not only to the nation, but to this community.
Thanks, Ron. I'm delighted actually that the park's going to be renamed after Jack. He wouldn't have cared actually about being acknowledged. I mean that, he just wouldn't have cared. But it's really nice to see that that work is being acknowledged, that achievement is being acknowledged.
Judy Mundey, it's been my privilege for you to come and return to Eastlakes and to be able to talk to me about Jack and the BLF's history.
Thanks, Ron.